You asked, so what could things have become? You could have imagined if that baton had been passed in whole from the Obama administration to the Clinton administration with this kind of AI strategy, an American public much more ready than it is for the kind of turns in AI that we're facing right now.
Welcome to Burning Platforms, our regular look at the politics of technology brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. I'm Peter Lewis. This week we spend time with Dr. Alondra Nelson, the architect of the Biden administration's blueprint on AI. We're in conversation with Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea and Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton, and we look at the current tech crossroads and some of the sliding door moments that have got us here. So welcome to a very historic episode of Burning Platforms, where we get to observe the morning routines of our panelists for the first time. I'm in the roof and I'm still in my pajamas and Ugg boots. Lizzie O'Shea from Digital Rights Watch. What does 8 a.m. look like for you?
8 a.m. looks like I've been up for quite a long time already because I've got a 3-year-old. So yeah, we just got him out the door.
Everything going well. And it's 6 a.m. in Perth and Dan is already on the tools. Are you a morning person, Dan?
Yeah, not by choice, unfortunately, but if I can sleep past 5 a.m. these days, I'm pretty lucky. I've got a middle-aged brain that wakes me up.
Always be hustling, Dan.
I know, always deals to be done. We're recording at this ungodly hour because we have the privilege of welcoming, and I'm going to put it out there, our most illustrious guest in the gloried history of this podcast, Dr. Alondra Nelson, who's joining us from Princeton, where she is the Harold F. Linder Chair and Professor in the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Study, which is an independent research centre at Princeton. So hi, Alondra, and thanks for taking the time to have a chat.
Good to see you, Peter. I'm glad to be here. That's quite the introduction. You've had many, many, many illustrious guests.
Yeah, you're probably up there. From 21 to 23, Alondra was Deputy Assistant to President Joe Biden and a Principal Deputy Director for Science and Society in the White House's Office of Science and Technology, where she performed the duties of the Director from February to October 2022. That's from Wikipedia, which really doesn't do the CV justice. And as we spend the next hour, listeners will understand what I'm getting at. So I didn't even know that much when I had the good luck to be seated next to you, Alondra, at a dinner last year. I knew you were a big deal, but I wasn't really across the details, which is my modus operandi. So I went to my go-to icebreaker. If we were making a movie about your life, what's the through line? And you played along, and I promised to write the screenplay, but the dog ate my homework, and it's a year later, so at least we can get the story down on tape because it is a ripping yarn. So we're not going to do our hot takes this week, but Lizzie and Dan, strap in and fire away at the appropriate time. So, Alondra, let's start with scene one. And I think I get this right, but there was lots of free alcohol that night. After the 2016 elections, you went out and spoke to a bunch of Democrats working in the failed Clinton campaign about what had happened, especially with respect to, I guess, science and the fact-based agenda of that party. So I'd love to dig into that journey a bit and what you discovered then and what you think we would learn now if we went through that discovery process again in 2025.
Yeah. So in, I think 2016, I published a book called The Social Life of DNA, and I had been writing about that. That was about the first 10 years of the startup industry of direct-to-consumer genetics. And, you know, much in the news today, the rise and fall of 23andMe is a little bit of part of that story as well. And I was curious about had followed the Obama administration and was very curious about their big kind of investments and big kind of discourse around science. So, there was a lot of, President Obama was on a lot of magazine covers, as presidents are, but he was on the cover of Scientific American and, Fast Company and, the Journal of the American Medical Association. So that he was sort of, his personality as president, in part, although not talked about a lot, had a lot to do with science and technology. It was a thing about that presidency. So as I was kind of bridging, having finished this book that came out in 2016, I really wanted to dig in and find out, what was sort of distinctive about the science and technology policy in this administration. And so I started interviewing people who had worked variously in science and technology policy. So who had worked at DARPA, which is the defense agency for research, who had worked at NIH and had worked at OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And, it was a fascinating conversation. I started the conversation, setting up the conversations before the election was completed. And so, I think the expectation was that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And of course, she didn't win. And so the interviews that I was having with people were them wanting to, and now having worked in government myself, you want people to have a sense of what you've done, right? Because you've given up a lot. I mean, the work is all consuming, you're working 20-hour days, you've got all these kind of missions that you're trying to accomplish. But there was also this kind of profound sense of sorrow that, like, the things that they thought that they were going to do, the things that they had thought they had put in train, were not going to be able to be carried forward. And so some of these things, some of that was true and some of it was not true. Some of these things were like the Brain Initiative, which was trying to be like a human genome project for mapping all the neurons in the brain, which is still ongoing, but I think lost some of its trajectory. Some of these things were some very first White House writing about AI and about what are the implications for rights and for jobs. So this is, 2012, 2014. And so you asked, so what could things have become? You could have imagined if that baton had been passed, in whole, from the Obama administration to the Clinton administration with this kind of AI strategy, an American public much more ready than it is for the kind of turns in AI that we're facing right now. So that's one thing that might have been different.
Mm. That discovery process is kind of science in itself, to go back to almost exit interview key parts of the Obama administration. So if we look at that today, like that rigor around the thinking of the policy, what do you see when you see the current administration sort of challenging science, taking on universities and defunding them if they've got particular, acronyms in programs? Like how far has that journey been?
Well, I think in the middle of that journey is COVID-19, which I think has a lot of stuff spins out from that in the policy space. So, through doing these interviews, I come to be part of this network of people that I didn't really know before. And then when it was clear that President Biden and Vice President-elect Harris were going to be the Democratic ticket, some of these people reached out because they were working on the campaign, and I started to work on writing science memos and tech policy memos for the new Biden administration. But part of that conversation and that transitional moment was already about how we were going to have to think about science and technology policy differently, because we had people who didn't trust vaccines. We had lots of people who, these were all, in some ways, all reasonable perspectives and postures, not, misgivings about vaccines, misgivings about government, misgivings about government science. So I think that one way of thinking about 2016 to now is, 2016 was almost the halcyon days, right? Where you could be like, there's a fundamental, people are upset, but there's a kind of foundational bit of trust. And a foundation, the foundation is holding a little bit, and we can sort of careen around it or try to do a little bit of business as usual. By the time you get to 2020 and we start on, I think, January 20th or 21st of 2021, you could no longer have this fantasy that everyone thought that science was good, that vaccines were good for everyone, that science taking place kind of out in the open with all of these preprint papers and fast moving science, and sort of showing that to the world, sort of showing to the world like, oh, that paper's not quite right. We're going to look over here. Or we thought that finding was right, And I think there was, people were trying to figure out in real time, what is this virus and what do we do about it? But part of that was a kind of, almost in a Barbarian sense, if you allow me to be academic, a kind of disenchantment, I think, with the public, right? That the public was like, we're not sure we wanted to see all this messy stuff about like how science gets made. And so what that leads to, I think, is real profound misgivings about, why are we paying for this? If it's wrong, if the papers are wrong, why are we doing it? Because the self-correction in science and technology, and I would, not even begin to say that there's not a lot of reform needed, in 2016 and 2020 and now. But, I think that the public wasn't so engaged in how messy that process was, right? So science happens and you get a drug, science happens and you get a thing. And so there was a lot of processual stuff happening in the open and a lot of uncertainty that meant that to come into office in 2021, that we were thinking about doing science policy in different ways, that we were thinking, we've got to engage more people. We hired at OSTP for the very first time people who had expertise in science communication. We were writing a lot more to the public about our work and trying to be more forthright about the policy work that we were doing. And, there were conversations, we're still having them now. We're having them also, I think, in your world, in the media, where it's like, how do we build trust, and I build it back. And I think what I feel right now, Peter, is that maybe we never get it back. Maybe it was never as high as we thought. Maybe we never get it back. And what does it mean to do journalism, research, policymaking in a low trust environment? To just accept that that's the case, and then sort of think about how we practice what we do a little bit differently. So I say all of that to get to the moment that we're in now, because I think we haven't figured out how to do that. And so there's certainly active catalyzing destructive forces. There is part of the Trump administration that wants to defund all of the research ecosystem and in so doing, own the libs, stick it to the elites, use your kind of phrase. But it's a very kind of self-destructive, it's contradictory with all of the kind of aspirations and claims and assertions of the administration kind of in every other space. So it's a real curious moment, but it I'm going to say this with scare quotes, it makes sense, right? In the context of a world in which you have such low trust and a lot of uncertainty, and have allowed to grow a lot without countervailing explanation, a lot of misgivings about science and government and the truth and facts.
It is also very interesting, Alondra, as a lawyer practicing in a legal system where you have to think about what might be the consequences of trust declining in the legal system as well. But it's interesting to hear about that from a science perspective. I think also Australians are slightly insulated, but we consume so much of the Anglosphere's media, like in English language, that some of the discussions that come out of the US are perhaps more influential than they might otherwise be. But I did just, before we move into this particular period or a bit more about the work that you did in the Biden White House, I just wanted to take a moment also to talk about the history of your work, because you obviously didn't come out of nowhere in 2016 either. I think what's interesting looking back at your body of work is that it doesn't feel like there's anyone that's really done the work that you've done before. You're this bridge between sociology and science, but with a particular focus on race that feels quite groundbreaking. I wanted to ask you if you could tell us a little bit about the book that you wrote about the Black Panthers, because I found it very interesting to learn about that, and you'll explain it better than me in a moment. But talking about the Black Panthers' focus on health and the concerns around how medical science has had a long history of racial discrimination. And I'll let you talk in a sec, but I did just want to point out that there is a relevance, I think, to Australia as well, because at the time the Black Panthers were talking about this actually also correlates with the time, or coincides with the time in Australia in which Aboriginal health services were being developed. And that now makes total sense to me, of course, in a number of decades later, because people trust Aboriginal health services, especially in remote communities, much more than they would services run by white people. But, you know, it's sort of hard to imagine that being something that didn't exist, but of course it didn't, and it had to be fought for and created. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how some of that earlier research then assisted in the difficulties or the challenges that you faced in technology policy in the White House.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So you're referencing my first book, which is called Body and Soul. And, you know, that book was trying to do a few different things, but I think one of them was, you know, I think like other people, I had been a student of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. And there was not a lot of literature on the Black Panther Party, but what you would see is it would say, oh, they had health clinics and they did sickle cell anemia testing, and sickle cell anemia is a genetic disease that disproportionately affects people of African descent. And then you'd find nothing else. And so I sat upon, you know, another 10-year project, doing interviews, historical research, et cetera. And what was super fascinating about that project was that's not dissimilar from this moment, Lizzie, which so I'd love you. Thank you for the opportunity to make to do that line through. Is that you had communities that were saying, we don't trust mainstream medicine. We don't trust any of this research and any of these doctors or scientists to treat us in ways that are actually going to advance our well-being. And so we have in the United States, and you know, you use the Aboriginal example as well, in Australia, generations of distrust of science and medicine. And so I think to encounter that in this moment, even if some of it is hysterical and conspiratorial, you know, coming from the space of writing about marginalized communities who've had this kind of long history, there's a way in which you understand it. And I think what your question suggests also is that we know that some of the answers to, at least historically, what has been helpful is to have Aboriginal doctors or people, you know, working in Aboriginal communities, you know, ditto LGBTQ communities, ditto African American communities. And so we know a few of the things that help to restore trust, but that's part of the through line. The other through line that's been really important in my work is that we need to pay attention to how non-experts, regular people, communities, however you want to call it, sort of meet technology and make sense of the technology. So in the case of the Black Panther Party, they were doing community-based genetic testing for genetic disease, which was unheard of in the 1960s. And they were able to do it because there was a new technology called SickleDex that was introduced that meant that you could instead of having these like large, what are called gel electrophoresis machines, you could have these little blood tests that you could do in a laboratory or a gymnasium or a park, and as they did. And so I was interested in this, what you might call like technology transfer. So what happens when a technology like that's meant to help different kind of diagnostic work in a laboratory becomes engaged in a community conversation and a community project? Ditto direct to consumer genetics, right? What happens when the sort of, you know, the product proceeds of the Human Genome Project become commercial consumer facing products that people use then to tell stories about their histories and their families and the like? And so so working in science policy, I was always thinking about what are the ways that people, so thinking about COVID-19 and, and the mRNA vaccines, how are people experiencing or understanding the processes that led to the production of these vaccines? How does it make sense? How are they narrating them for their lives? And so I think coming out of the trajectory of the work that you described certainly gave me a sense of how to think about racial health disparities, health inequality, but also about communities who wanted to be engaged with technology and, not just sort of recipients of it. And also a sense that, mistrust might be of medicine, of science, might be a normative posture and not an extreme posture. And that we got to think about that.
Alondra, if I could jump in there, I mean, I might take this up to AI, which I suspect we're going to spend a huge amount of time talking about for the rest of this now. But I think, just the way you've described that process there and how effectively different communities are meeting this technology. I mean, I think at least one of the advantages of that area that you've just described is that I was going to say it wasn't opaque, or at least it wasn't as opaque as the systems and algorithms that are governing how AI is working now. And so we're in this perhaps unprecedented scenario, or at least at this scale, where you've got millions and millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, perhaps billions, who are engaging with this technology for the first time. And yet the biases and decision-making that goes into the algorithms that are feeding the answers that people are getting, be that from OpenAI or Gemini or Grok or what have you, are really being decided by an incredibly small number of people. And we really don't have any insight, or very little insight at least, into how they're dealing with that, right? And we've seen this go badly too. I mean, obviously we saw Google overcorrecting with Gemini, with the Black Nazis issue that happened a year or so ago. So, it does look like at least there is some consideration of this, at least in some companies, but I suspect there's very little of it in a company like Grok, for example, or China's DeepSeek. I mean, what are your thoughts on this? Are there any lessons that can be gained from what we did with community health and how we engaged communities back then that could be brought to this new paradigm?
Yeah, in part, and I think I'll start somewhere else, but where I'll end up is the AI Bill of Rights, which is a project I did in the White House, which I think is one of the ways that we can think about how we can engage the broad public in these conversations around AI governance. But I think, there are a few things that I think are distinct about this moment. And, one of them is that in the absence of products that work definitively well, we have a lot of narrative. And so I think, and the narrative comes from, the narrative comes with like Odyssey level, kind of epic sweep. Like it's, like Holy Grail, it is the Odyssey, this is the kind of grand journey of human life. And so I think as intimidating as the technology can be for just the broad public, so also intimidating are these narratives, right? That are Skynet, sentient, beings, and these sorts of things. And so, and how do people find a way into those conversations? Some of them, there was some incredible reporting by Kashmir Hill, who always does incredible reporting in the New York Times last week. About how people are literally kind of being driven crazy, by, their engagements with chatbots. And so you could have imagined the introduction in November of 2022 of ChatGPT so Peter, I'm going to go to my utopian world, a world in which Hillary Clinton had won, and which the public had been prepared with tools and frameworks for how to think about AI, as opposed to, Sam Altman, God bless, like literally, should go down in history as like one of the world's greatest salespeople. And I mean that as a compliment, right? It's like, Sam knows how to tell a story about the future, right? That like people, that's like crunchy for people, they latch onto, that they want, that even if they're afraid of it, they want it, that kind of thing. So I think that we have, with AI for the public, we don't have the ability for them to have a lot of different narratives, right? It's very hard for them to say, well, I'm in the, sentient being camp, I'm in the Skynet camp, and I'm in the camp that thinks these are dumb tools that don't really work. The public really is faced with like, these work really well, right? And my boss is telling me that we've all got to learn how to use LLMs, and my board is telling me, and we've had to do redo our whole strategic plan around AI, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that there's been a kind of narrative capture around what the public can even imagine that makes it difficult. And I think, Dan, this accompanied with the challenges that we have around like explainability with the tools together, I think is really, really different from the 1960s, right? Because in community health or other community participatory research, these other moments, part of what those moments do are reframing or re-narrating what the moment means. And it's been just a lot harder, I think, with AI to do that, because the narrative drive. I mean, even when I was working mostly in human genetics, which is how I get to working on AI, even the sort of hype around the Human Genome Project, right? That it was going to end disease for all time, et cetera, et cetera. Like those are hard bubbles to I think puncture. And then you add to that technologies that fewer and fewer people, kind of understand at a fundamental level. To your point, I think it makes it much more difficult, but not impossible. And so our strategy with the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which is a policy document that was the first Biden, it was the kind of foundational Biden-Harris administration AI policy document, was really to address the conversation to the public. So the subtitle is like making automated systems work for the American public. The document's jargon-free. It's like 8th grade, US elementary school reading level. Like it's addressed to the public in part because it's engaged in some of that narrative reconstruction around the technology.
So, Alondra, let's move into this second scene in our grand narrative arc, which was your work with the White House. What was the process of getting your head around a technology that was kind of on the horizon without the big sales job? How did you go around saying this is going to be the position of the administration?
Well, we knew for sure that we wanted to carry forward some of the work that the Obama administration had done and kind of writing to the public about what these technologies meant. So there were, as I think I mentioned, there was a 2014 and 2016, maybe 2012 was whether as well, white papers that the first two were called, something around big data. And by the time you get to 2016, they're called, AI. So some responsibility to begin to narrate a kind of national strategy, to give some kind of national meaning to what these tools might potentially mean. So there was that. But to be clear, the Trump administration, Trump 1, had done some interesting work around AI. So they had established legislation that established something called the National AI Initiative Office. The legislation didn't pass until really the last week before the administration ended. And so it actually came to us to implement and give shape to all of this legislation. And so, so we had we had levers and we had, things that we could think through. But it was really clear to us. I mean, this is also a moment in which, people were starting to see viral videos about, whether or not you had light or dark hands, whether or not like sensors and water faucets work for you, et cetera, that people were becoming aware, well before, Dan mentioned the Black Nazis and the Google Gemini overcorrection for bias, but people were becoming aware a few years before of, particularly with computer vision and, visual uses of AI, facial recognition technology, that there were problems. So we were also going into office at a time in which that was part of the public discourse in the United States. And then it was clear this was going to be huge player in the commercial space, huge player already in the national security space, huge player already for economic competitiveness, et cetera. So there's no version of any presidential administration coming into office in 2021 in the United States that's not working on AI in like a kind of, sort of foregrounded way. For us, coming into office at the height of a pandemic, we were in the middle of an economic crisis. Like we just felt like we had to think about how to do this differently. And so for, starting this AI policy kind of trajectory really was like, how do we get the public to talk about this with us? So the first thing we do a few months in office is myself and another colleague at OSTP write an op-ed in Wired that basically is a call to action to the American public. It's addressed to the American public. It ends with an email address to the White House. And it basically says, write to us, let us know what you're thinking. What do you think about AI? And, we frame it around the Bill of Rights, which are amendments to the US Constitution that are intended to, as we say in the piece, put a check on what might be an all too powerful government, right? And so that's the kind of frame. How do we put a check on what might become an all too powerful technology in a way that's consistent with kind of foundational principles and values of American kind of democratic constitutional life. So that's the conceit.
How many wide readers responded?
We not that many actually. I think we had 150, maybe something, like not that many at all.
Wow.
But we also, I mean, those were, then we also had the email address people could make appointments. So we had standing appointments. Everybody who worked on this team had to block their calendar, and we would just, whoever would pop up, it was like a bit like chat roulette, not exactly, but people would sort of pop up and you would say, what do you want us to know about AI? And so this included rabbis, high school students, just kind of regular folks. What are you thinking? Of course, lots of researchers, right? I mean, most of our time was spent talking to industry and academic researchers, talking to entrepreneurs, big tech and little tech. But, I think in times past, AI policy, and you see it now in this administration, is is deemed to only be a conversation for tech players, and I don't even know for experts in this administration, right? If we're not even serious about research and about expertise, like, maybe that has even changed from Trump 1 to Trump 2. So the AI Bill of Rights as a document reflects some of what we heard. It distills some of what we heard. We make no, we're not trying to do novelty. I think you never want a government to try to be anything novel, leave that to entrepreneurs. But what are the best practices? What do we know are best practices? And so we try to distill that into 5 simple principles, and they're addressed to the public. It's, it's basically if AI is being used for a consequential decision in your life, you should have a right to know that it was used. And if the decision was about a mortgage or, resume screening or your healthcare, you should have some way to figure out how to ask a question about it, right? So it shouldn't be an AI version of a telephone tree in which you press 0 1,000 times to try to get to a human and never get to a human, right? So that's not to say that getting to the bottom of those answers might not be hard, but that the public should have an expectation that they can get some sort of feedback about the processes. And so it was really all directed to how these tools, as they became more expansive and public facing and including consumer use tools, how we might expect the public to want to be able to access those. So the document is certainly about types of AI, but that's not foregrounded. What's foregrounded is how the uses should allow people to have access to resources and access to opportunities, economic opportunities in life, and how AI should be framed for that.
Just one more before I throw to the other guys. So from that grassroots up or ground up engagement, was there anything that you heard that changed your mind or changed your perspective, or what was the value in opening it up like that?
We heard the young woman that I'm going to refer to in our organization was a high school student at the time. She's now a kind of technology policy advocate in Sacramento. And she's been on the Time 100 AI list, a young woman named Sneha Reniver, I think is her surname. But she had a nationwide organization called Encode Justice. So we had, high school kids from the Bay Area and from Illinois and Ohio who came online and said, we are really scared and freaked out. Our experience of going to school is we've got to go through metal detectors. And are we now going to have to go through facial recognition technology? Are we facing, as 16-year-olds, a world in which everything around us is sort of surveillance? And that was, I was actually really taken aback. I mean, it was sort of deeply felt by them. They were deeply worried. And it felt to me, as someone born in the Cold War, 1968, who grew up in the Cold War, it emotionally felt to me the same way that those of us who are my generation felt about kind of nuclear warfare and the nuclear holocaust, sort of growing up in the Cold War and sort of having a palpable sense that these tools might be so dangerous and the foreboding you have about the future. And you certainly, there's a part of the existential risk conversation, colleagues that I talk to who align themselves with that, who feel the same way. Emotionally, it feels very similar to me that there was just deep, deep concern. So there's certainly that. We were beginning already to hear about and there were papers like Ziad Obermeyer and Sindil Muthalayan papers on, bias in healthcare discrimination and sort of AI algorithms used in healthcare. So we were starting to hear about that. So you were hearing about healthcare, but I think the general thing was like, I was surprised about the concern of the young people, and then I was surprised about, not surprised, but we were affected by people just worrying about not getting a fair shake, right? Like that there were all of these ways in which these opaque processes were going to be deciding things about their lives and removing agency from them that just raised concern on lots of levels.
What the process you're describing, Alondra, just sounds so foreign. Like, I've participated in lots of consultations with our government, and even though some of them have been very open to it, like that openness is so incredible. And it is a way in which you can instill confidence and trust in policymakers as well. Like, I think a lot of policymakers feel very nervous about inviting the public into these discussions, and in fact see the public as kind of this faceless mass upon which you impose technology, and their objections are benighted, not from any place of expertise, so can be written off. And it just strikes me as a good model. I mean, the other thing you may not know is, I talk about this a lot, but Australians rank the most pessimistic about AI, I think up there with New Zealand and Finland. And
I've seen this data.
Yeah, I feel like that's an exciting statistic, because actually it sort of suggests that the sales technique of people like Sam Altman doesn't really cut it here. But it does require effort then to work out how you build trust in good uses of technology, or find, it puts you to task, I think, in a way that is good. But it does mean that some of the pronouncements from government that we should just all be using this technology.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it's convincing to start from a position that we have to just tell everybody to psychologically accept that we're right. Like, I don't think that works as a technique of convincing people. But you're welcome to comment on that long ramble. But what I actually wanted to ask you about is how did industry respond to this? I mean, obviously, this might take us into the next administration, but that's obviously changed. But I wondered how, in your experience in the White House at least, they responded to this approach to policymaking.
Yeah, well, so let me just, to your first point, I mean, the data in the US is also quite high, right? So, the data I use most often is, there's an American company that does something called the Edelman Trust Barometer that has like mistrust of, the US is right up there. I mean, probably not as high as Australia, but it's more than 50% mistrust of AI. And so, part of what I say now, out of government for 2 years, but spending a lot of time talking to federal and state level policymakers. I spent a lot of time talking to boardrooms and, not tech companies, but companies that use a lot of technology or trying to think about this, is that, we've got to figure out, to the extent that these tools are useful, and I do think they are useful just for some things, we've got to figure out this adoption piece. And so it's not sufficient to say, like, get over it, right?
Yeah.
I was at the Paris AI Action Summit, and when, Vice President JD Vance gave his speech, and part of his first speech, his first international speech about, and partly it was about AI, because the conference was about AI. And, he said, basically, people need to, his phrase was something like, get over their hand wringing about safety and just like lean in and use the tools. And, that's certainly partly true, but the reservations that people have are not irrational, right? I mean, there's journalism, there's research to back up everything. So it's not just speculation, and so I think that if government really wants people to use these chatbots for social services and, and all the things that are kind of being built bespoke and used off the shelf, that there is some responsibility to help people get there. And that's why, Peter, to go back to the originary moment, I lament that we weren't able in 2017 and 18 to sort of build a more sort of public conversation, about these tools. I lost the last part of your question, Lizzie. Can you come back on that?
Well, I just sort of wondered how the response of industry works.
Oh, industry.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I had never, so I became part of this network, this Washington network, because of this research I was doing. I had never thought I would ever work in Washington. So I'm a little bit also this kind of like weird outsider. It had not been an aspiration of mine. And if you've ever worked in government, you know that you're surrounded by people who, I mean, these are these extraordinary people who at like age 5 were like wearing suit coats and like always wanted to work in government. I mean, I had the most amazing colleagues who are now my dear friends, but like literally their whole lives, it just been like, I knew when I was 7 that all I ever wanted to do was like be a policymaker in DC. And DC is like filled with those people, and I'm just like, yeah, no, not me, So I felt like very much like an accident of fate or whatever, that there was, a racial crisis, an economic crisis, once in 100-year pandemic, like nobody trusts anything. And then, they're like, send in the weirdos, like maybe they can like bring in another approach or whatever. So what surprised me, and it shouldn't have, is that for every policy issue, if you're talking about scientific publishing, so we did some work around public access to federally funded research, for example, so sort of big publishing, every issue, there is the expectation that industry is supposed to write all the rules and like basically have full say. And so I think people were, I mean, in the same way that I think some of us experience some of what's happening in the second Trump administration as chaotic, I can imagine, like think in retrospect, that people who were used to lobbyists for industry, like literally writing tech laws, tech policy and science policy in DC, thought that we were doing was chaotic. Like I thought, in retrospect, I do appreciate that they thought that what we were doing was like completely bonkers, But, I think that, they would, in retrospect, for pretty much every policy issue, including crypto, so we also worked on crypto, would say, no one consulted us, no one talked to us, we had no idea. But what that means really is that we didn't get to like wholesale soup to nuts write the thing, right? Because we met with everybody. I mean, you could fill your calendar meeting with a lobbyist for a particular industry every single day. And they would just come and come and come. And, that's their job. And that's, they do their job well by like having these meetings, always trying to get a beat on what's happening, trying to kind of have this mind meld with you to try to get a sense of where the policy train is moving or not moving. So like, they should do their jobs, and many of them do their jobs well. But it was very peculiar to colleagues in industry that they had to collaborate in creating, creating policy, for sure.
Well,
and how it's narrated, sorry, Dan, please jump, and how it's narrated is there was so much regulation and no one talked to us, all of this, which is not true. But again, everyone plays their role in Washington. So game on, and I get it.
Alondra, on that topic of no one talking to us, this is going to be a very parochial radical question, so bear with me. But one of the things we feel in Australia is we are just so far away from the decision-making regarding all of this technology, but we are still impacted by it just as much as US citizens are, right? Like, and everyone else. And so, whether it's industry, as you've just been talking about, complaining about the fact that they're not having a seat at the table and a role on influencing these things. I mean, for us in Australia, whether it's the industry or the public, you have such little say over these sort of things. And as a result of that, you end up having to kind of come up with regulatory responses often, which are very imperfect in order to deal with some of the harms that come out of this. We saw this with the News Media Bargaining Code, which we've all sparred on for years, but it was a very flawed piece of regulation in a way, but it was also effective in dealing with one of the harms that came from big tech's control of sort of the digital economy and whatever else. So I guess I suspect I know the answer to this, but I'm going to perhaps have my cynicism confirmed. But is it ever a conversation, like in Washington, is there ever an acknowledgement of just how much influence the decisions that are made in the US and in Washington in particular on sort of regulating tech or putting guardrails around tech and everything else going to impact on global citizens and impact on people in other nations. Is that, obviously this is relevant in the context of AI, where you've got different systems and there's a bit of an arms race going on between China and America on this, but does it ever come up? I mean, is it ever a consideration? Tell me.
Yes and no. I think you see it with things like the U.S. being, not an eager, but a certainly willing and able participant in the UN AI advisory body process. So this process that was trying to create just guidelines for global governance. But I think that what the Trump administration, Trump 2, does is often say things out loud that aren't often not said out loud. And, so I think part of the tension what might have been a tension in the Obama administration or even in Trump 1, I think in Trump 2 is just like not a tension anymore. So the tension was, these are American companies for the most part, but they are multinational. And we see in moments in which there are, when organizations like then Facebook, now Meta, for communities in the global South or Southeast Asia become the entire internet for an entire country. And, political discourse gets inflamed. And is it happening on WhatsApp? And we don't, so there's that, there's a kind of awareness of that. There is, but a kind of confusion, I think a purposeful confusion around where liability sits for that. And that, I think, sometimes we use the technology complexity argument around that. But I think what we hear in the second Trump administration is, we have an American interest in protecting these American companies. And so, sorry, Australia, sorry, EU, great that you have your GDPR or your Digital Services Act fines that you want to render on Meta or Google or whatever, but it's in our national interest to protect them from these fines and let them go about their work. And so I would say, yes. I mean, I think where you see evidence of this coming up, Dan, not sort of discussed explicitly, but certainly in my time in the Biden administration, there were new entities were sprung up, like the Trade and Technology Council, which was an EU, US, sort of network, which I'm not sure whether or not it still exists. Obviously, some of the programs in AUKUS that were about sort of technology training and fellowships across, STEM fellowships across countries, the UN processes that I mentioned. So I think that certainly in the Biden administration, there was a sense that even if the most nationalist American policymakers wanted to be in charge, that there was a sense that there was a broader constituency to which you at least had to be in conversation. I'm not sure that that's the case now. So,
well, I'm sure it isn't.
I'm conscious of time, and I don't feel like we've nailed the end of this drama.
Okay.
Let's go to the final scene. Trump comes in, he does a couple of things. Firstly, he's bankrolled by the tech overlords. Secondly, he rips up the executive order that you have painstakingly put together. And thirdly, there's this kind of counterbalance that there should be no AI regulation for the next decade and just let it rip. And finally, back to Dan's point with Australia, this is now, if we do anything to regulate here, it's going to be protectionism and encouraging, a trade war. So
the diplomatic crisis, sure.
So within those constraints, how does this movie end? Is this going to be walking into a glorious sunset? Is it Cormac McCarthy's Road? Where do you think we're going?
That is a good question. I mean, a couple of things that I feel like I need to say. So with the Biden AI executive order, because it's now talked about by colleagues in the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, as being pages and pages of regulation, which it just actually was not. I mean, an executive order is just, in most instances, not regulation.
I thought it was a photo op for Trump.
Well,
yeah.
The executive order, the Biden executive order, included things like, I am directing the Department of Labor to do some research and some forecasting on what the job impacts might be as the use of AI expands, and to think about piloting some programs on upskilling and reskilling people, and to do this in partnership with labor unions. Like that was the kind of stuff that was ditto the Department of Education. Like, how should we be thinking about protecting young people's privacy as these tools are used in classrooms or whatever? So I just want to anybody that's listening, part of me wishes the Biden AI executive order had been full of regulation, but it's policy, it wasn't regulation. The other thing I would say is that there's a sleight of hand, I think, that the Trump administration is pulling when it says there's no AI regulation, because all of what they're doing is AI regulation, right? So expanding export controls is AI regulation. Deregulating energy is AI regulation. Turning off incentives for solar and wind, right, which is, to my mind, from my political perspective, part of the kind of portfolio approach one needs to take to energy. If we need more energy to get more energy on the grid to build out these tools and technologies in a reasonable way, is AI policy, right? A lot of these trade war conversations about magnets, critical minerals, rare earth, all of that is AI policy. So when I hear members of the Trump administration say, we have no regulation, we're not doing any AI policy, we're just going to let it rip. It's like I would want to, I'm enough of a social scientist that I would want to kind of empirically look at it. But there's probably a perspective on this that says they're doing more AI regulation than maybe before, right? Believe it or not. So they are putting thumbs on scales. They are making decisions about the trajectory of AI. And, I think some of the decisions that are being made really lots of things that we know. We know that already the kind of deregulation of things like gas turbines to build more energy, the expansion of use of data centers are harming communities, noise pollution, standard pollution, et cetera. That's a form of AI regulation. We know, as we, was talking about with Lizzie, that the polling data amongst the American public on AI is really bad. And the data around jobs, job loss, people's anxiety about job loss, obviously people's concerns about creative labor, and about, where the data comes from, the training data to train these models, and whether or not people are going to be compensated. There's a great kind of sense of anxiety, and it is bipartisan. I might be on some issues higher, like sort of, maybe the environmental concerns might be higher among Democrats than Republicans, but they're pretty broadly shared around the things that we need for the hardware and software to build out the AI ecosystem. So I think we're supposed to have, they've done an RFI, request for information, the Trump administration, and they're supposed to release a national AI policy this month. Actually, I think before the end of this month. Was the TikTok on that came out of in one of the early executive orders from President Trump. So we'll see what the plan looks like, and maybe that will give us some pointers, Peter. But I think it's the case that I worry that no one is tending to the public, and no one is paying attention to. I worry that no one's paying attention to how people are experiencing these technologies, other than investigative reporters and advocates who are working on the ground, who are already critical of sort of big tech and its implications. And so to attempt to do Trojan horse governance, right? This kind of we're not doing any AI governance, we're not doing any AI regulation except, and to be doing that without I think anything that's preparing, people for change, that's willing to put constraints on things, which, I think actually drives innovation, I think is really worrisome. And it worries me as a social scientist and as a policy maker, on the level of increased social disintegration, is it just going to make all of our kind of societal aches and pains, polarization, disinformation, misinformation, distrust, just all of that, is it going to make it worse? And moreover, is that kind of distrust ecosystem going to be the engine for greater kind of social disintegration. It's quite worrisome.
I mean, there's this growing idea in Australia that we used to have, that we would have this AI Act, like following a European model, like a single act to regulate the technology. And it's interesting hearing you talk about this, because obviously it's multiple fields of policymaking that are touched on by this form of technology. Like, it's more an ecosystem than a specific tool. I wondered though, we are now facing a different world, especially post-January, where some of even those initiatives, should we have an act or not, seem to have a new light on them in a context in which trade is, and, tariffs are on the agenda. But I wondered if you did have a situation where the White House changed hands tomorrow. I mean, obviously, you sort of started to answer it in the sense that you've got a big focus on in bringing the public into this conversation, but where do you think are the regulatory fields in which you think people who are interested in this topic should be paying the most attention? What is the work that you'd get started on first?
Yeah, I mean, so we haven't really talked about sort of the national security pieces of this. I mean, we're seeing kind of wars happen around us that are using drones, probably, AI centered, or, sort of AI enabled in some capacity. So, we probably need to have some sort of treaty or some sort of something around autonomous weapons, around, like that's those are big things. Yeah. I think that we need to, I think, figure out, I think to Dan's point about who gets to make the rules in some global fashion, or some, allies and partners fashion. Like, what are we going to say are the red lines for these tools? And that's not to say that bad actors are going to abide them, but like, do we want to sort of create some like thresholds or benchmarks around these? And some of the things I would suggest, Lizzie, are like kind of old things. I mean, how do we get kind of basic transparency around some of the technology? That's not to go at all into people's trade secrets, or to like anything that makes their products kind of distinct on the marketplace, but can we know more about what's happening? And we were starting to get a little bit of that with the AI Safety Institute. Is there one in Australia as well? Safety Institute? No. So there's the UK one. I think South Korea has one. The US has one. The name has changed in the last couple of weeks. So I think it's now called the Institute, or the Center for Safety and Standards and Innovation, I think it's called. So I'm not quite sure what the work is, but these endeavors to create these new sort of public-private institutions that would allow some parties who work in the public interest to know a little bit more about the tools, I think that's pretty important. And then, we've got right now we're doing AI regulation in the United States by lawsuit, right? So like the Writers Guild is suing the New York Times. It's like we've got all of these kind of artists, or musicians are suing various kinds of large language model makers and the like. And so part of how we'll be making policy is through this. And I think to have some, if I was going back in tomorrow, I think we need to make a decision about where liability sits, about what we're going to do about copyright and training data. I mean, these are really hard things, and there's no easy answers, obviously. But like, I think the conversation has to be started. And I think a kind of laissez-faire approach to these is, it's not good for business. It's not good for competition. And, it's certainly not good for adoption and sort of public confidence.
Alondra, one thing you haven't mentioned in that list of sort of how you tackle AI and the potential harms that might come from it is privacy, which is my hobby horse. So apologies if anyone's rolling their eyes, but it does seem to me it's not an accident that the US was the first territory to develop this. I mean, there's probably a number of reasons for that, but I think one of the reasons is the fact that you have very, very lax privacy regulation there, and therefore people's data is sort of, it's open season, and all these models are trained on a whole bunch of data, and they're now remembering interactions with people, and that's how they're using it to make personalized recommendations and get better and better. I mean, I do worry about this because it seems that, if you look at Apple, who have had a commitment, imperfect as it is, a commitment to consumer privacy, and as a result of that, are pretty much nowhere in this race. and you compare that to some of these models, which are just basically trying to hoover up as much data as they possibly can from as many places as they can. Isn't that one of the areas where we could put some guardrails on this tech, or is that less important than what you've mentioned?
No, I think it's, in my time in the Biden administration, there were we got close in 2 attempts in the Congress to get national privacy law. So I think while I was still in the administration, so I think in the first or second year of the Biden administration, and then in like the 4th year. And, one of the barriers is, well, the sort of stated barriers is the question, and this comes up, Peter, in the question about the moratorium that you suggested, because there's going to be a 10-year moratorium is proposed in this reconciliation bill that's now in the US Senate on AI regulation at the state level. So hopefully that won't come to pass. But part of what happened with privacy legislation in the United States in the first 2 years of the Biden administration is you had bipartisan, bicameral support. You got very, very close. And then the question of preemption in California came up. The state of California has had privacy legislation for a very long time, is a good privacy regulator, and has been, we talk about the Brussels effect as, the power of the EU, but in the political science literature that comes from, the Brussels effect is named after the California effect, which was about the ways that California, as one of the world's largest economies, could shape environmental policy, and so there's a California effect around privacy, and sort of things would come to a skid around, are we going to federally adopt the California law? Are we going to allow California to be an outlier, or are we going to do something else? So that's when it fell apart in the first instance. In the second instance, it got more narrow, and it just became a children's privacy law. So it was about kind of age gates and these sorts of things. I think there's a lot of things that make it really hard. So I don't have the data in front of me, but certainly one of the larger and more successful American industries are data brokers, right? The vast market and buying and selling all of our data kind of constantly. And during my time in the Biden administration, I think the president did sign 1 or 2 executive orders that was trying to constrain how these data circulated, and and was sort of saying that these data couldn't circulate to countries of concern, and that you also shouldn't be selling them to countries of concern if you're an ally and partner. So there was some attempt to sort of, in the national security space, sort of put some constraints, but in the commercial space, none whatsoever. The bigger challenge I think that we're going to face in the United States generationally is that young people think of privacy in totally different ways from me, from everybody on this pod. And so I think we're even losing the kind of, we're losing the case, or losing the thread with, 20 somethings and 30 somethings who say, I've been online my whole life and nothing bad's happened. I mean, they're kind of just like, nothing's happened to me. And we're just like, no, there's a vast surveillance web, So I think there's a lot around privacy, and I totally share your concerns. I mean, one of the principles of the AI Bill of Rights was, a kind of right to data privacy. Yeah. So, yeah.
Look, it's almost time to roll the credits. I'm not sure what our end scene looks like, except a lot of hard work for everyone to keep thinking this through. And thank you for your leadership globally in helping us think it through, Alondra. Before we go, if people want to keep this conversation going, we've now got our little closed community in the Democracy Sandpit. We've been playing around with this for a little while, this idea of how do we build a place that's not on one of the big tech platforms to keep these conversations going. Lizzie and Dan have been playing in the Sandpit. Is the first kids in the in the box. It's getting there, isn't it, Lizzie? Like, there's some nice people sharing some ideas.
It's like slow burn social media with your friends, which is nice.
Yeah, Amy, who always gives us the heads up via email, is now posting sort of the latest from around the world each morning to keep us in the loop. And there are some nice exchanges. So you'll be welcome to the Sandpit too. So I'll send you an invite to Alondra. But we'll put in the Wired article, a link to the executive order, but also the initial blueprint and some of your other writings and works, and encourage people to dig deeper into this. So, hey, thanks. It was such a Pleasure to have you with us. And thanks, Dan and Lizzie, for getting up early and earlier. And we'll catch you again in a fortnight.
You've been listening to Burning Platforms. It was recorded on June 19 and produced on Naarm land by Rebecca Connell. Talk again soon.